You say this person is finding the concept difficult. I know they're coming out of a very different world, but what concept in particular would that be? What is it that is an obstacle right away for them as they encounter some of these ideas? I see we've been joined by a few other people. If you'd be kind enough to type in your names, where you're connecting from, so we can communicate, and feel free to ask any questions that spontaneously pop up in your mind. This is just a free time and opportunity. Internal versus external efforts. How very interesting. It makes me think right off the bat of the difference between the East and West, where it is said the East is about being and the West is about doing. And yet, the reality is that we cannot do without being. And it is very much at the heart of the words of Christ, cleansing the inside of the cup. And even more so when referencing the Pharisees, whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones, because the Pharisees were doing good, were following all the rules, were performing, if you will, according to the Mosaic laws in a fashion that was an example, a model for the society. And yet it is the internal that matters. And it's interesting that would be the stumbling block. Oftentimes in the past, there's been this absurd inability from some to transcend the paradox that this is not a self-centered thing or a self-absorption thing. It's a purification for the capacity to give out authentically. I remember my friends in France have said, both of whom have passed away now, wonderful saintly human beings, the Gottmans, were accused of navel gazing because the activists in Europe assumed that meditation and self-awareness, vigilance was an inward self-absorption, when in fact it is the key to authentic right action in the world, without the filters, without the hidden motives, and especially without the ego. It is that battle with what the world calls the ego that is the foremost battle, overcoming false personality and all those hidden agendas that we have. You told me this person that you're referring to is with this preterist background, very specific kind of, shall we say, distortion of Christianity, and wife of a pastor, which further entangles them. But the irony is that prayer itself, which should be at the center of their lives, is about that inner transformation when one encounters the holy. I see Cindy writing in and saying ego is the biggest foe. That is it. And as you know, in the work, we call it false personality, and have a very specific way to identify how it's created, what it impacts in our way of functioning, like inner considering and the purposes of vanity and pride and the illusions that we have. Those moments of freedom, of humility that are possible for us by not identifying, by just being present like a child, and that innocence without agendas is an extraordinary experience to taste. David says, strong Calvinist views. What a prison that is. if you go back to the origins and see how deviant these views are from where Christianity comes from, you can see why the rigidity itself becomes a stumbling block to spiritual progress. Hello, Nathan. And you ask, what would you say is the purpose of the ego? I see Cindy retracted a message. Be free. This is spontaneous. This is for us to just experience. So, yes. So, Nathan, you say, what would be the purpose of the ego? My heavens. What is the purpose of the narcissist? Utter self-interest. In a more metaphysical sense, it is placing oneself in the Holy of Holies instead of God. It is a real, the word diabolical comes to mind, placing of oneself in the center of reality, dominating it for its own self-interests. And yet it is all thin air. It is all imaginary. One can understand the needs of an infant having to be fed and always focused on me as a fundamental evolutionary stage, a primal stage. But when one advances in life, then that kind of infantile relationship to the world is catastrophic, because it cuts us off from the way of being that is fundamentally a matter of connectedness, empathy, compassion, mercy. All that makes us alive, ultimately, love. And the ego has taken that element of love and made it focused on itself. And it is a death, a spiritual death. Cindy, always watching for an I that is operating. Which I is this? That's very good, because that immediately creates an inner separation, a liberation, a disidentifying with that which we have always taken to be ourselves. That's a quantum leap to be able to do that, because then you are not immediately reduced to just reacting to whatever is coming through and taking over. Consider this multiplicity, which will be the subject of the newsletter coming out today, this fragmented multiplicity that we are, as we seek unity, as we have the illusion of unity. In that illusion, we take all this multiplicity one at a time as the unity. So there is no consistency, no dependability, no aim and direction. So separating ourselves from that I is a tremendous leap of transformation, which is the sort of the fundamental leap that most people cannot accomplish because they are so imprisoned in this lower state of consciousness where everything that comes through takes over, and there is no higher level, there is no master that can look down and discern the differences in energy and purpose of what is passing through us. Let's see. Nathan, you say, in this way, selfishness is a disease. Most certainly. But like all things in life, they are not inherently bad, they're just out of control. Gurdjieff, for instance, famously said, and it has to be well understood, you must first be a conscious egotist before you can be a conscious altruist. What does that mean? The example is used of a parent in an airplane with their infant, their child must put the oxygen mask on first before they can put it on the child. They cannot save the child without necessarily saving themselves. And the metaphor here is that we must put our house in order internally, find our authenticity, liberate ourselves from the chains that have automatically wrapped themselves around us as we reacted to life, as we are wounded by life, as we are influenced by life. We must find our way into a higher place in ourselves that can then be of use to others. We are of no use to others if we remain totally fragmented and, as I said, inconsistent, undependable. It is our inner peace, our steadiness, that is the key blessing to others. Hello, Monica. Under the name Michael there, but it's Monica. Welcome. Perth, Ontario, Canada. Wonderful to have you together. My aim here is to schedule well in advance so that we can all have the opportunity to gather, and you can have the opportunity to think through what you can bring to the table, what you can ask under these circumstances. Nathan, you're from the UK as well. Spiritual death, that's what ego and selfishness is. David, you say, I seem to forget how easy it is to feed these eyes unconsciously. Absolutely. Not only that, but they are like vampires. Negativity, for instance, actively, aggressively seeks to generate more negativity. That momentum building up, that famous scenario of starting the day off, stubbing your toe, being irritated, then having lots of traffic, being more irritated, then trouble at the office, more. That snowballing is not just random circumstance, it's the initiation of a momentum that has a purpose to eat us alive, to take the life force of that day and consume it toxically rather than allow us to save it for the purpose of enlightenment. And all of these different little eyes, little parts of ourselves have their agenda. And to know them, and we must do that with humor even. This is not heavy-handed, even though it is life and death, if you will, but to accept our condition and work through it with lightness of being and grace, not taking ourselves so seriously anymore, because there is no self to take seriously. There's just this chaos. There will be a self to discover eventually that is sacred. Micah. Yes, we will be developing this live opportunity. And you say, make sure information comes out in good time. Absolutely. And you're from Sweden. Wonderful. The wonder of the internet, which is so much more than the mechanics of it. Teilhard de Chardin, the great scientist, priest, prophet, foresaw this. He called it the neosphere, the noosphere, like a nervous system wrapped around the planet in which people would be able to communicate in a new way. He saw this in the 1930s. And here we are in the midst of this global pandemic, and we are able to transcend it completely, and in the safety of our separate places, find communion together. Cindy, you say fragmented multiplicity is very shocking to observe and watch. Do I really do that? Absolutely. That's a fabulous recognition, because false personality does not want to admit that. This is why Nicole says, don't be too quick to expose someone to their own false personality, because it will turn around and bite you. People don't want to know this. You have to have come to a place in life to be willing to face this reality with a great deal of humility and preparedness for something new to come into your life. And the other factor here is that, if you'll recall the teachings on buffers, we have these mechanisms that keep us from seeing such contradictions. And that's why in the past, and for most people, they will swear that they're one person. I'm a good person, and have no memory of all the times that wasn't the case. And so in that inner separation and observing eye, which is critical from that other higher place, that other quality of attention, objectively we can see, yes, we do that, and it is utterly paradoxical. And understand why it's so important not to judge ourselves, because that immediately bursts the balloon, if you will, of being able to watch and learn from what you're seeing. As soon as we judge ourselves, which we're in such a habit of doing, we lose the perspective from which we can actually see. And we are weighed down, we fall back in, we get lost in that ocean of chaos that we are trying to look at from above. Accept those contradictions, because this process will purify us, will unify us, will liberate us from such painful contradictions, both to ourselves and to others. I imagine everybody's able to see what is being written on the side there. Canada, Calgary, Canadians, folks from the UK, Sweden, isn't that wonderful? All with common interests, who could never find each other, find ourselves otherwise. You know, for someone like me from the 70s, such a phenomenon is impossible. And as most of you probably know from experience, those of us who are on such a path of following the yearning of our spirit, of our heart, we are solitary outsiders. No one else understands us. I'm sure that's the experience for all of you in some way or another, until we finally make it someplace through books, through the mystery of spirit guiding us, to discover others who have lived before, have been on that path. And then there are some in this world that we can join in some way in community, which is what I did. The trouble is that instantly in an actual community, all of those things we're working on want to take over. And so what would have been a gathering of a community of authentic spiritual seekers can become a cult in no time at all, with hierarchies and power and perversion, etc. So this right now allows us to remain in the best part of ourselves without the oh so human ways of degenerating after having made such a good start. So this is a true spiritual gift for all of us. Let's see. Monica, question: how does one stay in a state of observation and detachment all of the time in full awareness? You know, it is I would say twofold. It is developing a muscle, developing an ability that you patiently nurture. In the beginning, especially, the more times you fail, the more you learn. I remember Uspensky's famous example in Search of the Miraculous. He was remembering himself with intensity, a man who had given everything for these ideas, for these experiences. And so he's walking down a street in St. Petersburg or Moscow and focused, vigilant, aware. Imagine under the influence of Gurdjieff and his power, his electricity. And then suddenly he realizes that he's disappeared for a while. And he wakes up, if you will, realizing that from that time of self-remembering, he has gone to the store to buy his cigarettes. He's gone here and there, completely disconnected. And the shock of that feeds the valuation, the understanding of how significant it is. So that's one, is every time you have an experience that you in your most intimate self can taste and value and see what it does for you, you will want it more and more. And when you lose it and lose that peace and experience the damage of another way of being, that will give you more energy to go back at it until eventually it becomes, in a sense, the air that you breathe. And truly, we find that it is a natural, I say natural, although conscious way of existing. I think of in agricultural days when one took the cows out to pasture, the pace, the way of relating to nature, all of that helped a certain quality of way of being that we've completely lost in the modern world. And so recovering that presence, that sense of self, that appreciation of the moment is so life-giving that one wants nothing else. And you find that it isn't through strain and stress. It is effortless effort, as is said in the East, as my friends the Gottmans often quoted. So it is not a tension. It is a presence. It is a remembrance. It is a joy. Enter into the joy of your master. And every time we get identified, we remember what could have been in that moment. Or every time there is damage created by being caught up in anger and identification, the burn of that reminds us that there is another option. And so more and more that becomes the way. And it makes us different people, different from those around us. I want to say, for instance, and we'll go into that further down the road, but those of you who have jobs and such may have noticed that one of the key ingredients in the workplace is to share common identifications. You are valued if you identify with what they identify with. And if you are in a state of peace, a state of authenticity, and are not playing the game of being all caught up in what it is everybody else is supposed to be caught up in, you are a problem. Surely many of you must know this experience. And it can be soul-wrenching to see that. I'll share more about my experiences of where I've just worked and watched people sell their souls to that. This is why true personality, as Gurdjieff calls it, is a critical piece as we progress. We cannot just be liberated from false personality and find essence and be out in the world. A, because we are too different, we are too vulnerable, and B, because we must be reasonable and know how to function in the world. And this requires understanding what the circumstances demand, understanding the level of being of people around you who need to see some behavior that's familiar to them so they can relate to you. It's a matter of compassion. I'll use the word acting, but it's not in its hypocritic sense. It's in its sense of being able to communicate where that person is and knowing what is necessary. So this, you can see what kind of maturity it takes to pull all that together. And at the same time, it is magnificent art because it is making of the most ordinary things of life the greatest of opportunities for a dynamic spiritual existence. Let's see. There's Brenda. Hello, Brenda. Just arrived. David, it's all about creating space in the middle of havoc and not just getting swept away. Absolutely. And as each of us becomes an experienced explorer of these things, of ourselves, of how things function, we'll see that being swept away is the very purpose of everything around us. The news, politics, media, people's personalities. And so we're in constant confrontation with this intensity of energy that will pull the rug out from under us. And you can see why self-mastery is such an art, such a gift, such a strength. A self-mastery that may be utterly invisible to another. It is indeed the art of living. And this is where we can be thankful to Gurdjieff and the Fourth Way, even though they're not unique in that. But it shows us how to manage all this in the heart of life. It is so much easier to go to a monastery, even though one runs into the same things on another level. But its rhythm and silence and common purpose give us a third force, as Gurdjieff says. In life, we become our third force. And you can see how that creates a shortcut, if you will, because so much more needs to be managed out of our own inspired commitment to this. Having compassion and gentleness with self is so important. That's right. We are not out to destroy something, even though we are seeking to overcome wrong work. Even in the face of our wrong work, seeing it, shall we say, with brutal honesty, and the necessity of that. To see ourselves, if you will, psychologically naked. That which is seeing, that higher part of ourselves must have compassion. That's how we avoid the judgment that loses all perception, but also it's the healing process. If you, outside of yourself, your higher self can see why you do what you do, why that part of you, shall we say, lies, hides, is crippled in some way, that wrong work, rather than trying to break it down with a hammer, if you will, to lovingly heal it so that it can dissolve, it can be free, it can merge with your essence, your joy. You can see what glorious transformation can occur for you. Cindy says we self-flagellate instead of use the information for growth. Probably, you say probably just I do this. No, that self-flagellation is absolutely. I'm sure everyone here would say that's right. Especially the more you go into this, the more you're honest with yourself. It's hard not to be disappointed, shall we say, because in a sense, we are raw in our conscience, confronted with this stark truth about ourselves. And in many cases, religion is a channel of self-flagellation in relation to the sacred, the holy, the good, the pure in who we are. Notice the subtlety with which we can avoid the mistake that is so typical in religious settings of repentance, not as self-flagellation, but as metanoia, transformation. Transformation of mind, of understanding, of being. It does no good to hold on to guilt, We have to live with the sting of what we see, but then we have to get to work and heal and understand the dynamics and do what we can to evolve from it and learn from it. The tragedy of that religious form of self-flagellation, both literal and psychological, is that it does not lead to growth. You stay on the same level. Believe me, I've seen it up close and personal. I've seen priests, for instance, saying, I'm such an awful person. I'm such a bad person. Well, this is 20 years into their religious work. It may be okay to have an initial awareness to break down the ego, but then you have to become the good person that you can be, the potential that God has placed in you to become. We leave behind feeling bad about how bad we are in order to become that which we are called to be. Nathan, question. In Beauty and the Beast, okay, we see Beauty become imprisoned by the Beast, and then when Beauty tries to escape, it is the Beast who saves her from the wolves. They eventually fall in love. Is ego the beast? Well, there's no question that in these fables, in these legends, there is rich esoteric teaching. For instance, those of you who followed what I've shared on centers of gravity and the deck of cards may have made the connection that, interestingly, in Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll is revealing a bit of information that was unknown to the mainstream and still is. And how interesting that the character of the Queen of Hearts literally is the teaching embedded in that ancient symbol of the emotional part of the emotional center, of the swing of the pendulum, of the off with their heads kind of behavior that some people have as a constant, if you will, and that we all have inside at certain times and have all experienced. So, to answer your question, I would say in this case that it is probably more convoluted than that. Yes, it is Beauty that turns the Beast into a prince. And so the Beast must save Beauty because Beauty saves him. It is ego evolving into the true self, the prince, beyond the primal rawness of what is represented by the beast and which could be considered ego. So I would say that's a fair analysis. Monique from Dallas, Texas. How marvelous. We've got 20 people here. And please forgive me for throwing this out like this all of a sudden. But it's fascinating to see how from around the world people have appeared and responded. Even without warning, without schedule, breaking routines in the middle of a work day. So this is a test both technically and spiritually of those who could drop everything and suddenly jump right in. It's a delight to see this. I see Tim from Asheville joins us. Hello, Tim. Let's see. We have Scott from Kansas City saying we need more of these live talks. They are coming. That's why this is happening now. And they will be more carefully organized. This is just spontaneous, improvisational. It is good to connect. Look at David, including us marshals. Yes, a marshal can be still and quiet. Hard to do when adrenals are so quick to pump through the body. I hope that some of these past teachings have been helpful to you. I realize they were quick and limited and just the tip of the iceberg. But perhaps some of you have seen how that little bit of extra information feeds into one's understanding of oneself and of others, and one's ability to pull away from the illusion that we are so utterly unique and therefore unified that we can't possibly be mechanical and automatic. Those of us who've traveled the world and seen twin people of others that we've known on other continents have had the shock of realizing that we're not as unique as we think we are. And yet, like all truths, it is paradoxical because we are utterly unique, just not in our mechanicalness that we're often so proud of. Workplace is toxic. Brenda, could you speak a little in regards to the saying, abide in me? How very interesting. Critical words from the Christ, brought forth in the Gospel of John, in particular through the metaphor of the vine. He who does not abide in me, the branch that is broken off, put into the fire, and let's not associate wrongly with that. It's not the fire of hell, which some would have assumed. It is simply the uselessness of a life that is not rooted in the Spirit. And so this question of yours fits right into what we're talking about. We are seeking the real self, the true self, the spiritual self, the essential self, the purified self. And in so doing, we are connecting with that dimension of us that is mingled with the spiritual realm. The earthly, mechanical, automatic, reactive is only minimally connected. It is when we go deeper within, when we pull out of the noise and chaos, that we can hear the quality of another way of being. We can hear, feel in the present moment a presence. And when the Christ says, abide in me, he is calling us to go all the way into that, for lack of another term, higher consciousness, in which our identity fuses to a certain extent, without losing its individuality, with his, the first fruit of many, the prototype, the way, the gate, the one who shows, who incarnates what humanity is meant to be, incarnating the sacred. So abiding in that level of presence, of consciousness, of understanding, of love, is the summit of all of this work. As St. Paul says, not I, but Christ lives within me. That Christ is the true self, and yet more. So as we begin with the simplest thing of observation in the ordinary things of life, we are on a path that is profoundly mystical, profoundly transformational, profoundly revelatory. We will discover organically, if you will, each one of us, something about the nature of the holy. That's what this work is. It is just as intense as what the monk is doing on top of a mountain or in his monastery or ashram. It's just that we, in this modern world, are doing it in the craziness of existence, in some ways more dangerously, but more free to turn everything that comes our way into fuel for that fire, ultimately to abide in the Christ. We have a friend from South Africa. Wonderful. Cecil Mitchell from Atlanta. Hello, Cecil. Jovan says, can you talk about inner considering? Certainly, very significant. Something that each and every one of us has to deal with in multiple degrees. Inner considering. We'll take the simplest thing. You're sitting at a table eating, you see someone looking at you, or two people talking to each other, and one looks over at you, and you're sure deep inside you feel sick, you feel tense because they must be talking about you. Or maybe the look that he gives you or she gives you seems judgmental or rejecting you in some way. This whole scenario we build up of what others are thinking of us. These are not just moments. We live in that all the time. It is the air that we breathe. And it is almost all imagination. Someone looks at you in a strange way and you feel offended or hurt, and maybe they're having indigestion. And you cannot know that. What you do need to know is it is critical to become free of it, to become free of what you think others are thinking of you. And especially of things like being offended. I'm still amazed that people, will ask me, well, I hope I didn't offend you. And my friends, there is a time and place in your life when you can live without ever being offended. Because what is offended? Of course, it's the false personality, it's ego, it's pride, it's vanity, fear, all of that wrong work. Imagine the liberation, the peace to not ever be offended again. There are people like that in this world. They have worked on themselves, but they exist. That is what we are meant to discover in this world. Enter into the glorious freedom of the children of God. Freedom from being worried about what others think. Freedom from the invisible reins and chains that others have on you. Freedom from the ego that is constantly watching out for how others are treating it. What madness that is. And this is why humility, and I mean radical humility, is so fundamental. And many of us get there when we crash and burn. So if you have gone through such a drama, be thankful for it. Because out of those ashes, you can truly walk a new path, rise up in a new way. Inner considering is one of the strongest influences on our psyche. And it is one of those elements of wrong work that we can simply unplug, whether it's all at once or a bit at a time. And all of that energy that is saved from that can be used precisely to head toward that state we call abiding in Him, abiding in our authenticity, in the freedom and joy that and peace that our Creator intended for us. Let's see. We can talk much more about that, certainly. There will be many more encounters like this. Our friend says, we are in a crossroad of absolutely, of course. Unfortunately, one of the dark elements in this time is not merely the rampant atheism and materialism that is crushing the spirit of our humanity, but the deviant or superficial qualities of faith that are made known in the culture. What the TV evangelists have done in terms of turning people off to religion or captivating people is in many ways a spiritual crime. So this reality that faith indeed is crucial, we must continually purify what that means. That is to say, working on yourself to find peace, to be lighter, to be free of the wrong work and the self-obsession that darkens our psychology, opens the door to a greater and greater faith. It makes me think of the dark night of the soul that we'll talk about in future gatherings, where the ultimate end is to have discovered an entirely new level of faith, that even in the darkest night, with the feeling of abandonment, traversing that without any expectation other than holding on to absolute trust and faith, leads to a whole new revelation of what is this faith, what is this relationship in this world that we live in. A friend from Slovenia, how wonderful. Paul from Australia, 6 a.m. here. And you say you missed the first part. Glad to be here now. We will make available some version of this. And my assurance to you is that there will be many more. Look at that. Cindy say, enjoying all the company from around the world. Yes, indeed. Isn't this extraordinary? And as I said earlier, for it to be so immediate, spontaneous, we who are people who have to have programming and scheduling and the right way to do things, to have this sudden, unexpected, improvised, free event, and now 27 people from around the world with us is a great gift for all of us. Jovan says, you said in some video that when we try to please other people, this is inner considering. And many of us have this difficulty of saying no because we don't want to be disliked by others. So if I choose to not say no, even though I know that I should, that perhaps by saying yes, it's going to be bad for me, and I do have personal experience of that, the stronger feeling takes over and makes me say what will please the other person so that there won't be any conflict or dislike or judgment. So I go against my own better judgment, my own self-preservation even, to give this other person what I think will enable a relationship that I desire from them, to not hurt their feelings, to not make them mad at me. Surely we all know that. So again, all of this has to be done with great sensitive super marshals who have no care in the world for how people feel and will tell it like it is and crush them in the midst of that brutal honesty. That's not the answer to not inner considering. Facing that is to be able to see in the moment why you're thinking to make the choice that you're going to make, and to balance that out with your own being true to thyself and compassion for that other person. So this is once again why it is such an art and such an individual art, each of you in your own way, with your own creativity, the qualities of your own persona, is called to find the beautiful way, do something beautiful for God, the beautiful way to not be a victim of a long-standing habit of wanting to please everyone so that you can be liked too, with overcoming your own concerns about yourself to give that person what they need. You see the balance in all that. The fourth way is to become a balanced person, but that is so much more than what those words might suggest, because it is about spiritual balance. And as a free person, you can choose to use your freedom to not be free and therefore give the person what they need. You see what I mean? All of this is your choice in that moment of your conscious awareness, of your understanding of yourself and your issues, and of what the circumstances require for right action. Don't hesitate for follow-up questions. Write them down for the next time we meet, because these are very significant and complex issues. When you say that this stage of detaching and or purging can be very difficult and can even cause despondency, melancholy, and despair, certainly it is always possible to step into the shadows, uh, but and particularly in the purging stage where you don't quite yet know where you're going to land. In some ways, you're giving up what is familiar and comfortable, including not just your own inner habits, but how you've lived, how others live, what you considered life to be, for something that is not yet tasted, really. But I would suggest to you that as soon as you experience the results of the application of some of these teachings, such as being able to make another choice besides just reacting in the moment, through the discipline and effort of self-observation, divided attention, inner separation, that you are already on your way to a higher level within that is not likely to fall into melancholia. Melancholia comes in the early stages, really before this work, which brings so much light into your being. Melancholia comes with the yearning that cannot find, or that finds the wrong things, that comes into dead ends, that is not clear about what is ahead or what is present, even though we don't know it. But as you make your own the tranquility, the clarity of mind, the understanding, you are in a place where that part of you that would feel sorry for itself, allow itself to be depressed, is less likely to have force in you. It is already made passive. Now, clearly there's ups and downs, but I would suggest to you that you have enough right now, and certainly call on me when that's not the case, that it is possible to not look back. Put your hand to the plow, as Christ says, and don't look back. Go forward. And what is forward is a selflessness that will not allow itself to indulge in those feelings, those tendencies, because now things are more and more focused on something other than oneself, which is infinite, which is pure, which is holy, which is present, which is at the heart of our own nature. Be sure that we can find that. If you're having trouble past those first steps, that's why we're here to talk about it. That's why I'm calling for questions, because I want to help each of you rise up far enough to know that there's no turning back, because this is too good. This is how it's meant to be. And know that you're not alone. That this is why, from the beginning, these little points of light down through the centuries have been given to humanity, so that those with those common needs and desires and longings can come together in some way, find the guidance, find the strength to fly on their own and to be what they were born to be. Don't hesitate to follow up, because I know it can be very complicated, and I don't want to make light of the melancholia. I would say that detachment should lead to the opposite. Detachment, as Meister Eckhart speaks of, and the great mystics, is a higher plane. It's a liberation. And it is not a repression, mind you. Be sure of that. It is a transportation of certain kinds of emotions into other emotions that belong to us in a way we did not realize. Detachment leads to total connectedness. We enter a quantum dimension, if you will, because we are detaching from something very small and petty. We are not cutting ourselves off from feeling. We are entering a whole new horizon of what feeling is. I imagine that's a little vague for some. Write it down, bring it up again. After reading St. John's masterwork of the same name, I purchased his collected works. Currently, I'm reading Evelyn Underhill's Mysticism. That was an extremely important book to me for years, some 40 years ago. It is one of the great classics written by this amazing little Anglican woman whose husband and son didn't share any of her opinions. And she was a world scholar of mysticism, of experiential mysticism. And you will find in there a library of quotations of experiences of the mystics that is truly enlightening, and of the ability of combining that sort of religious experience with the psychological one in terms of consciousness and other things. And all of her works are full of light. And this little woman ended up at the end giving retreats to the priests of her church. So that's a terrific book. And let me point out that making those connections between the best of religion and spirituality and psychology and these teachings, that is what the fourth way is meant to become. It cannot remain in a box that belonged to Gurdjieff and his people and their so-called descendants and their schools. We cannot reduce it to terms because it's all about the one great thing, which is the awakening of human consciousness to the divine. So we eventually break through all of those categories for the one true life-giving thing. Hello, Christine. Robin says, might consider Zoom as a format for live sessions. Why don't you write to me at my email address and tell me why? Because I'm simply experimenting with the options. Those of you who've been around for years know that we tried Google Hangouts, which I thought was going to go away. But let's find the best, and I'll be happy to take any suggestions on how we can do this in a way that works for everyone to the best of our ability. You say, it seems the more I detached and pure, the more I realize there's to detach and purge from. True enough, but ultimately, let's use the metaphor of St. John of the Cross. The whole aim is to clean the window so that the divine sun can shine through. And that may take all kinds of subtle forms, but as it begins to happen, it will be very clear to you what a beautiful thing that is and what a natural thing that is to discover. In the midst of transient moments of melancholia, I have been overwhelmed by moments of grace, peace, and comfort, so I know you are speaking truth. Also, mysticism is amazing, yes. Could you speak about prayer of the heart from Father Alphonse Gottman? Is it good to pray the Jesus prayer if you were not baptized in church to find guidance, to find path to church? Very good question. The Jesus prayer, as some of you may know, is a foundational method, way of being from the ancient church, rooted in the origins. And this glorious book that I translated from Father Alphonse and Gottman and Rachel Gottman is the one he's speaking of. If you're interested, I can send you a link. It's on Amazon, and it is a masterpiece, especially for those who need to be introduced to it. This prayer is not only a way of centering, it is a way of connecting. The full prayer is, Lord Jesus, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, as the book does, each word is gone through so that you can unpack it beyond any associations and realize what it is. But it is a mystical power that not only centers you in the heart of your need, but as St. Theophan the Recluse said, creates a divided attention. You're aware of your need before the divine, and you're aware of the mercy of the divine. And that creates an alignment that is extremely powerful for those of you who've tasted it. And it may be unusual for the West, but it comes highly recommended, just like the power of the sign of the cross, unknown to the Protestants, has a mystical capacity that was known in the East that we have yet to discover. This prayer is even more so because it names the reality of the divine that has mercy on us and makes us conscious of our need and conscious of the help that can come to us. It can be life-saving. So your question is, can you do that outside of a church without guidance? The classic or the standard answer in Orthodoxy would be, of course not. And after 25 years of my doing it and of translating the book, I came across these lines. Of course, you can only do it in the context and guidance of the church through which it came. Although it wasn't really just the church, it was the tradition, the oral tradition, therefore way beyond institution. So as some of you know, I went into the heart of the Orthodox Church, immersed myself completely, and certainly understood that this is its natural environment because of the depth of mysticism and of a way of life that is found in good orthodoxy. By that I mean not exoteric, not surface, but that which is known deep within and deeply informed by the Holy Fathers and their teachings. And so, yes, one can be tremendously enriched by finding it in its true home. But I would say to you, in answer to your question, of course, you can use it for its own spiritual power without the specific directions of those who have, if you will, ownership of it. You'll find more when you find the right books. But then if you enter the church, you'll find that many repeat it mechanically and meaninglessly, even against the advice of the ancient teachers. So it always all comes down to one's authenticity and relationship to the reality of God. And ultimately, outside of the boundaries of guides and institutions and religions and traditions, there is that reality, you and the Holy. And in that unique and individual connection, the miracle is that we find We are all connected. Through that, our own uniqueness, we find the collective reality of God's love for each of us. Robin says, I use Zoom in my private practice with other online. Okay. Please send Amazon link of Father Alphonse Gottman's Prayer of the Heart. I will certainly do that. Brenda says, I've used Zoom. I can confirm it's stable, very interactive. I'm guessing that with Zoom, I can hear you speak back, which would be nice. I just went for the simplest, most efficient way. So we'll figure that out. Send me to my email. You all know my email, tednottingham@hotmail.com, and I'll take your best advice on these matters. Let's see. Rob says, leaving Jesus and the teachings on a shelf and not using it, that's okay. They don't want to go deeper. That's right. What's interesting is in a group like this one, whatever your belief system is, whatever your background is, whatever your experiences are, what we have in common is this profound inner hunger for self-change, for authenticity, for becoming. And that transcends all the differences. It allows me to use religious language that might not be comfortable for you, because we know that at the heart of it all is the experiential reality of interchange for the good. And whether that leads to experience of God in those terms or terms that you're more comfortable with, the point is, it is that expansion of yourself to your higher self, to your purposeful being here, to your well-being at the deepest level that becomes a blessing to others. So that's what we have in common as spiritual seekers. So don't be concerned about terms that you thought you ran away from or left behind or never understood, because what we can understand is the common experience of what it is to not be completely identified, completely lost in that which is illusion and false, unfinished people. We are seeking to become people of light, which is our true nature. Do you have super chats? Don't know what that is. I don't know if you like that. Okay, I'll take all the suggestions you have. I am not technologically advanced in these matters. David, thirst for the holy. That's right, thirst for the holy. Our friend says, recommending Written in Our Hearts, which is one of my primary books, sharing my experience, including my journey in that community I mentioned earlier, and where I went from there. Nathan, question, as one becomes more aware of mechanicalness in oneself and others, how does one deal with anger as a response to this? When one truly realizes we are sleeping, how to find peace? Well, it would seem to me that discovering mechanicalness ought to be a moment of liberation rather than a reaction of anger, because to see this unknown phenomena to most of the world of human mechanicalness is to no longer be victimized by it. is to understand why this person functions as they do. Bringing understanding, bringing greater perspective to how people function takes the edge off of it, because you realize they can't help themselves. I suppose on some level there might be some anger, but that should dissolve very quickly, because you have your hands on a key now to functioning in the world in a way that is no longer in the basement of things, no longer in the chaos and fragmentation of things. You are finding a way of being that is not weighed down by the folly of humanity. And that kind of grace and miracle, that liberation, should bring joy, should bring mercy. So feel free to share more at some other time if you want, or by email, why you have anger. Because ultimately it is clarity of vision that is offered to you. And how to find peace. How to find peace when you realize that you're sleeping is to begin to no longer sleep, and be patient with that, a little bit at a time. Give yourself those moments where you can breathe in that quality of presence and vigilance, awareness not of yourself, but of that which is. Now you're included in that, but you're no longer pulling it all into yourself. Again, that strange paradox. To be present is to be liberated from yourself, to enjoy all that is. It takes you to a more expanded state of consciousness, and out of that comes peace, because you're not locked into this prison of self full of concerns. It makes me think of what the great Rodney Collins said, one of the students of Ouspensky, his primary student. Once again, walking through these paradoxes, to remember yourself is to forget yourself. To remember yourself is to remember God. Hello, Mark. Good to see you. Let's see. Okay. You mentioned James Finley, who was a, shall we say, scholar of Thomas Merton. Some of you may know Thomas Merton was very important to me 40 years ago, critical. In fact, in the transition from the Gurdjieffian Fourth Way School into Christian mysticism, I'd already been engaged with that as food for the soul, but Thomas Merton, perhaps the greatest writer, spiritual writer of the 20th century, put it in a language of experience so clear, so succinct, that he made the connection, the fusion for me. I think in particular of his book, New Seeds of Contemplation. Rob says, evangelical style Christianity to me was wicked as a child. I literally felt scared and angry with God that I had to throw my whole life out because it was one giant sin. And at 13, that's scary. Yes, that is classic example of the distortion of theology. And it's like self-observation objectively. Once you see the history of how these ideas went from here all the way down to here, then you can begin to heal, to rediscover what it was really about. Because as some of you may have heard me say, original sin was not the teaching of the ancient church. It's a complex mindset. It was more ancestral sin, and by that was meant the generic phenomena of being human, and therefore the tendency through self-will and willfulness to not surrender to God, not abandon oneself to God. And yet we need the free will to love God back. It became original sin through one man, St. Augustine, who became the church father for the Roman Catholic Church for the West, and his own issues with sexuality, his own particular focus, narrowed it down. And then it degenerated further with Protestantism that took it from the Catholic Church to create Calvin and others who turned it into you're born evil. None of that was in the original teachings. So once we understand how we got victimized by a historically degenerated way of thinking, how being born in America with the influence of frontier fundamentalism, what that did to our sense of religion, can wake us up completely and renew us on the path of rediscovering the authentic teachings without being crushed by the misuse and misrepresentation of them. David says, anger gives way to compassion. Yes, through understanding in particular. Our friend Michael, although I don't think it's Michael, I think it's Monica, wishing you all a peace-filled Advent season. May it be so. Thank you. We will do that again during this season, and I'll give you a couple weeks' notice, perhaps, so that we can be more focused, more specific in what we accomplished together. But it was important to get started. So we're going to wrap things up here in a moment. Let me see a few more of these. Once I found through you, Christ is love, and no one is left an orphan. Yes. Something you wanted to throw away. You know, that's been my experience as a pastor. Most of the new people that came into my community had left the church 30 years ago, had become seekers in the East, but something in them told them there was something to be discovered in the mystical dimension of the teachings of Christ. Somehow they knew intuitively something was missing, and at the age of 60, they would come back in spite of it all to see what could be found. And we speak of Thomas Merton, Thoughts in Solitude, great book, yes. Rock asks where to find a roadmap of forthright practices with descriptions which leads to another. Okay, so this is one thing that we can do through these live sessions, is walk through some of this a bit at a time. I will release some introductory videos. As most of you know, I approach this in the Socratic method. Your questions, your experiences with the ideas generate my responses. I'm not looking to create a systematic methodology because, for one thing, there isn't one. This is not a formula. Just look at Maurice Nicol's commentaries. I understand that it is necessary to get a foothold to be able to begin. So let's make these times together an opportunity to concentrate on these matters and to review with others who've been through this before, which is always critical to rediscover in a new way, and we will walk through this. But my justification for this is that your own experience of a moment where non-identifying allowed you to rechannel the energy, to see things differently, to make different choices than you have perhaps ever in your life, is so illuminating that you know for yourself what the power of these ideas are. And then you begin to hunger for more, to try more, to search more, to ask more. But I will provide as much as possible in the details, so hang in there. Allison says, I felt great confusion waking up from mechanicalness because whatever I was in that moment didn't know how to behave or respond. I kind of got real quiet. Well, that's probably the place to go, because in that quiet, you are outside of the eyes. You are perhaps more an observing eye. You are not so influenced or imprisoned by what we have taken to be ourself in this vacuum, in this whirlpool, I should say, of passing thoughts. Yes, it can give you vertigo. In fact, there's a term, psychological vertigo, that can happen to us as we displace our sense of self, and that has to be reintegrated for sure. So any of you who feel that, please communicate so that we can walk you through it, bring you healing, bring you alignment and understanding. Try to do this, with a certain lightness so that there isn't any destruction. This should all be positive, enhancing, freeing. David says, yes, please. I imagine you're referring to what? To what Allison said, or to the roadmap? Because I know many people need the instruction booklet. And you say it feels wonderful to see how many people have been drawn to this work. It makes me feel less alone. That's correct. The Wisdom Fourth Way. I haven't read it, but plan on doing so. Yes. And then, yes, of course, Rebecca's book, The Work, is a very clear synthesis of the commentaries. Should be very helpful for those of you who need to get a handle intellectually, if you will, on these experiential teachings. We've recommended it many times. And a friend comes in just now, saw the email. Don't worry, this will be shared with all of you if all goes well with YouTube to record it. And we will most definitely do this again. So let's see, we've been at this for some time. We've got 31 people who joined on the spot without warning, and I'm very grateful to all of you. It's touched my heart. Be sure that we will do this again soon. There'll be plenty of time. Don't hesitate to send me any comments, any suggestions of how it can better help you. We will pursue this more in the future. You'll all be getting some version of this encounter, this test run, as I call it, and we'll take it from there. God bless all of you, and we will meet again.